Hi, and welcome back to Heimlich's History. Now, last lecture we saw how our nation was struggling and staggering under the weight of the Great Depression. But while we were doing that, there was a storm brewing across the sea in Europe. And that storm will produce the most cataclysmic conflict of the age, namely World War II. And since there is more to say about this than there is time to say it, let's get to it.
It's time to kick it old school.
So during the 30s and post-war Europe, economic depression and the smart of national shame gave rise to a terrifying new form of government, the totalitarian dictatorship. You see, for totalitarians, the individual is nothing and the state is everything. In the USSR, the magnificently mustachioed Joseph Stalin emerged as the dictator. He crushed his enemies and sent loads of dissidents to work camps in frozen Siberia. And in Italy, there was the swaggering Benito Mussolini, but most frightening of all was Germany's rising hero Adolf Hitler. Now, Hitler despised the manner in which Germany was shamed in the Treaty of Versailles as the bearer of all the guilt for the war. And he further despised the crippling reparation payments which Germany was forced to make to the Allied victors, which had the effect of turning Germany into an impoverished state. In light of all this, Hitler withdrew Germany from the League of Nations and began a vigorous new program of illegal rearmament. Now, at the news of this, it frightened Americans a great deal, but not enough to actually do anything about it. We went right back into our little isolationist hole. In fact, we curved so far in on ourselves that Congress passed a series of laws that made it illegal to go to war unless we were invaded. And so President Roosevelt declared that America would indeed remain neutral in this conflict. Meanwhile, in Germany, Hitler was overseeing a vast expansion of the German army, and with this new force, he took over German-speaking Austria. And democratic powers like Britain and France, and to a lesser degree America, thought, okay, this will pacify old Hitler. But then Hitler struck out for more, intoxicated with the realization that France and Britain were so resistant to go to war that they wouldn't resist Hitler's land grabs. He went after the Sudetenland of neighboring Czechoslovakia. Now, alarmed by this, French and British leaders got together with Hitler and said, hey, how much land do you need to be satisfied? To which Hitler responded, how about the rest of Czechoslovakia? And they said, are you sure that's all? And Hitler was like, yeah. So they agreed to let Hitler have all of Czechoslovakia for his crazy millennial kingdom of the Third Reich. To which everyone in Czechoslovakia was like, wait, what? Now I love how David Kennedy puts this. He said that giving Hitler Czechoslovakia with the hopes of satisfying his thirst for land was like giving a cannibal a finger in the hopes of saving an arm. And indeed, at the taste of the finger, Hitler found himself hungering for the arm. And so on September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded neighboring Poland. Now, France and Britain, realizing that Hitler would never be appeased, at long last declared war on Germany. And way across the Atlantic, President Roosevelt hastened to say, hey, in case y'all forgot, neutral. But as a nice little consequence of this declaration of war, orders for war munitions from European countries got our factories cranking like mad and had the effect of pulling us out of the Depression. Thanks, Hitler. But in the midst of all of this craziness, it was time for another presidential election. And Americans were hesitant to switch horses midstream. If we did end up in the European war, better to have someone with some experience at the helm. And so for the first time in American history, George Washington's two-term precedent was broken, and FDR was elected to a third term. Now, back across the sea, Hitler had moved with great power and invaded France and conquered it. And with this sudden fall of a democratic nation, Americans were shaken out of their neutrality high and realized that the only thing that stood between a democratic and totalitarian Europe was Britain. And so while still desiring to avoid entering the war, America provided huge amounts of munitions and supplies to the beleaguered British Isle, which, as everyone could see, was not a neutral move. I mean, if y'all are really going to be neutral, why aren't you providing weapons for Germany as well? Now, there were two consequences to this. First, it had the unintended consequence of getting our factories all geared up for all-out war preparation, which would prove a vital ingredient for victory later on. Second, it convinced Hitler Hitler that the United States was not in fact neutral, and that if they entered the war, they would in fact enter it on the side of the Allies. And since the memory of decisive American intervention in World War I was still fresh on Hitler's mind, he knew that something had to be done, and done quickly. So Hitler's ally, Japan, decided to get that thing done. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese bombers unexpectedly descended upon a naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. They destroyed much of the American fleet and caused about 3,000 American casualties. And when news of this atrocity reached the public, there was only one thing to do: declare war. And Hitler saved the Congress any temptation to argue about it by going ahead and declaring war on us. And so now we're in it. Now the fighting of this war deserves much more attention than I'm about to give it, but I want to focus on two campaigns, specifically the invasion of Normandy and the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. First, Normandy. So Russia had been clamoring for a long time for a second front against Hitler to relieve the pressure that Hitler was applying to Russia. So the Allied powers trained their sights on Normandy, which was a coastal town on the north side of France. So on June 6, 1944, known as D-Day, Allied forces launched an amphibious assault on the German-occupied French town. And after stiff casualties, the Allies were victorious and began to move into the interior of France. And by August of 1944, Allied troops had liberated France from Hitler's grasp. And after that, Hitler's holdings began dropping from his hand one after another. Until, and I am skipping so much, he finally surrendered on April 12, 1945. Well, technically German officials surrendered because Hitler killed himself to avoid being captured. Meanwhile, back at home, the news of VE Day, that's Victory in Europe Day, stirred Americans up into massive celebrations. But not all was well at home. You see, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, Americans got a little twitchy about all the Japanese Americans who lived especially on the western coast. After all, they reasoned, won't they take up the cause of Mother Japan? And so the solution to this was to forcibly remove Japanese Americans, in most cases American citizens, into concentration camps in California, Oregon, and Washington. In all, 117,000 Japanese Americans were relocated into these internment camps. And the constitutionality of all this was even upheld by the Supreme Court in a case called Korematsu versus the United States. Now you should know that the federal government later apologized for all of this, but it happened nonetheless. And speaking of Japan, once the Allies had achieved victory in Europe, they trained their sights on Japan. There had been a handful of battles on islands around Japan like Midway and Okinawa, and as American strategists began to consider the mounting cost of human lives that a mainland invasion would cost, they decided on a new plan. And the new plan went by the name the Manhattan Project. Now, the Manhattan Project had been working for years to create a bomb by the splitting of atoms. And at long last, they had done it. The atomic bomb was capable of more destruction by far than any weapon that had ever been conceived in the history of the world. And it was set and tested and ready. And in light of the powerful Japanese refusal to surrender, Harry Truman... Wait, did I mention that Roosevelt died in his 4th term and now his vice president, Harry Truman, is the president? Well, now I said it. Truman ordered the bombing of the city of Hiroshima. And in one blinding flash of light, fire rained down from the sky, instantly killing over 70,000 Japanese civilians and wounding about 110,000 more. Still, Japan refused to surrender, so a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. And this bomb killed or wounded 80,000 people. And at this crushing blow, Japan was brought to its knees and made it surrender. And the war was over. It was a triumph back home, the likes of which America had never known before, and the celebration stretched on for weeks. But in the dropping of the atomic bomb, we inadvertently ushered the world into a new age, namely the atomic age. One unfortunate result of all of this is that fresh from the tables of peace negotiations for World War II, we entered into a new kind of war, namely a Cold War. But I am long since out of time, and so I will see you next time.